As human beings, we have an unparalleled capacity to imagine, to fantasize, and construct scenarios in our mind. A few other species, such as, for example, other primates, crowids, and elephants have shown similar capabilities, but those are still far from the complexity of human imagination. This amazing ability makes us capable of showing empathy for people on the other side of the planet and realize our part in history. We can feel pride for the works of past generations who lived hundreds of years ago and responsibility for future ones. But this also has drawbacks. We can imagine the unfeasible, the unreal and impossible. And if we don't realize that we in fact do, and instead believe that what we are imagining is something feasible, real and possible, we will most likely end up hurting ourselves or others. In this short video I will take up the very important distinction between meaning well, being convinced and doing good, and put forward an argument why all three matters and why none of these can be excluded. A very good foundation for fulfilling these three aspects when we interact with the rest of the world is to make sure our cognitive functions and systems are as honed as possible. This is something that I discussed in my other video, the 4 cornerstones of being human. The problem with this topic is that it's dead simple to understand, but extremely hard to internalize and act on. When we look at others, it becomes blatantly clear, but when you look at yourself, it becomes much, much, much harder. But anyhow, let's try to unpack this. The overall thesis of this discussion is that it doesn't really matter if you mean well or how convinced you are if you're not actually do good. Most people mean well. We are a social species and we have an innate desire to belong to a group, and hence we strive to satisfy its members in one form or the other. But a person who tries to achieve something that's beyond his or her capabilities will fail. It's also the case that a person sometimes lacks knowledge about the impact of an action as to create unintended bad consequences. To avoid this, it's crucial to be humble about one's knowledge and capabilities. There's an idiom that states that it's the thought that counts. This is, however, a potentially harmful mindset. This would mean that as long as you mean well, the outcome is of no relevance. This is obviously false. If a doctor reliably killed all his patients even though he tried to save them, he wouldn't be employed for very long. We care first and foremost about the results. A better idiom to go by is "the road to hell is paved with good intention," which highlights the fact that meaning well without action could be just as detrimental as trying to actively worsen the situation. If a person is about to drown, he or she will die unless someone acts, regardless of people's intention. "I meant to save him or her" doesn't change or mean anything in a pragmatic sense. If one doesn't mean well, it's likewise a possibility that they will fail in their mischief and end up doing good. Although this certainly is a positive unintended consequence, it's more or less up to chance. Quite obviously, it's preferential to mean well when trying to do good. It all boils down to the fact that there's a disconnect between our intentions and the results. We are all fallible. We could be wrong and we don't know everything. Therefore, an expected outcome of an event doesn't necessarily match the observed outcome. You could probably, on the top of your head, come up with a long list of philosophies or organizations where the practitioners are absolutely convinced of their belief, maybe even to the degree that they are willing to die for it. Some of these philosophies are mutually exclusive, meaning that they can't both be true. From this simple thought experiment, we see that mere conviction doesn't necessarily lead one to truth. And if one is about to act on this false conviction, unintended harm might quite possibly be the outcome. As mentioned initially, it's easy to see this amongst others, but let's take a look at ourselves. Take a belief or understanding that you are extremely convinced of. Do you realize that it might very well be wrong? Thoughts like, "But I'm so certain of this. I can't imagine it any other way," or "It's not the same thing for me," might very well creep up when you start to questioning your own convictions. These are personal biases and might cause you some cognitive dissonance. However, the fact still remains that you could be wrong, even if you have good reason for being convinced. Although good reasons tend to minimize the extent and possibility of being wrong. Certainty is certainly something to strive for, but since we're fallible human beings, we can't be absolutely certain of anything. Furthermore, certainty is not the same thing as conviction. Certainty is externally established using data and information from the real world. Two people should be able to agree on the certainty of something, while conviction is subjective and might not stem from certainty. So one should try to do good with a sane amount of conviction that should stem from one's certainty rather than, for example, emotional grounds. Regardless of how good one's intention or how convinced you are, no change will occur unless one acts on those intentions and convictions. Now, change doesn't have to be good, but I believe it's fairly safe to say that good, in the sense of increased well-being, is generally preferred. And since we are to a large extent a very social species, well-being for oneself is tightly connected to the well-being of the community which one is part of. Although I won't go too deep into the individual contra community discussion in this video, I think this assumption isn't too far-fetched. Secondly, doing good could also be seen as the end goal, meaning that if you want to do good, the two prior points are prerequisites for coming here. In this day and age, there's a lot of confusion about what doing something actually means. Traditionally, the distinction between action and non-action has been easier, but today it's very much possible to act without crafting, building, or creating something physical. Teaching as well as learning is two examples of activities that's most often considered as doing something, although you don't necessarily get a hand-on experience. On the other hand, learning is utterly useless if you don't act and practice your knowledge, either through passing the knowledge on or applying it for some sort of problem solving. As might be clear now, however, one can't just look at one specific action and tell if it's doing good or not. An alternating chain of learning and teaching is one of the pillars of civilizations, but without the off-branching of people pragmatically applying their knowledge, no good will come out of this knowledge. The same goes for a lot of internet activism, often called slacktivism, where people either upvote, repost, share, or similar to spread the word or raise awareness. It can feel as if one is actually doing something, but if it's the case that one to a very large extent is part of a non-productive learning and teaching cycle, this would be to deceive oneself. One might also raise the vitally important points of focus and effectiveness. Although every little bit helps might be true, a bigger bit will help more. And by spending some time thinking about how to be more effective and what problems are more acute, one can be able to do more good with the same or even less effort. This concludes this short lecture. I hope this is a good cognitive tool to help focus one's mind and perhaps recognize some of our biases. Please tell me what you think in the comment section, and I thank you for watching.